So good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the City Match Conference. We are excited to have Dr. Jeff Winter present to you at this year's conference. The title of the session today is Fostering Resilience Among Youth and Families of Refugee and Immigrant Backgrounds. My name is Kiera Lyons, and I'm a project coordinator here at City Match. City Match is located in Omaha, Nebraska, and we want to make sure that we first acknowledge that we are on the ancestral and homeland of the Omaha Nation. Now, to give you some background information of our speaker, Dr. Winter is an attending psychologist and researcher at the Boston Children's Hospital Trauma and Community Resilience Center, and an instructor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Winter's work is primarily focused on developing, disseminating, and implementing culturally responsive and trauma-informed psychological interventions of youth and families of refugee and immigrant backgrounds. For more information about Dr. Winter, you can view it on our conference platform. Now, we have a couple housekeeping rules. Please make sure you remain on mute throughout the presentation. And please feel free to submit any questions through our chat and come off mute during our Q&A portion at the end of the session. Dr. Winter will try to answer any questions that clarify his topic. Okay, so without further ado, it is our pleasure to introduce you Dr. Jeff Winter.
Great, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Can folks see that? Are folks able to see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to present today and to participate in the City Match Conference. It's a real honor to be invited, and just wanted to thank all the folks, Nishka, Kiara, and other folks involved in organizing the conference and inviting me. I know it's a huge amount of work to put together a conference, and in particular in our sort of hybrid virtual ecosystem for academic conferences. So I really appreciate it. So today I'll be presenting Fostering Resilience Among Youth and Families of Refugee and Immigrant Backgrounds. Again, my name is Jeff Winter. I'm a psychologist and researcher based in Boston, Massachusetts at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. As we're going through the presentation today, if folks have any questions, feel free to populate them in the chat and we'll discuss them. I'll break out time at the end. And you're welcome to email me or any of my colleagues down the road. And we'll go from there. So I'll talk for probably about an hour and 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion. So funding for some of the current work we'll be talking about comes from a Thrasher Research Fund Early Career Award. And then a large portion of the work, we're honored to be a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a Category 2 Treatment Development and Intervention Center. And the PI of that grant is Heidi Ellis, who's the director of our center, and no other disclosures to report. So this is our group in Boston, the Trauma and Community Resilience Center. These are a couple of photos from the past couple of years. We have a couple of other new folks who aren't featured here. And it's really just important on the front end of a presentation focused on refugee and immigrant youth to acknowledge that, social justice focused work, work that's focused on community-based participatory action research is a team effort. And although I'm, sitting here today talking about our work, I'm only here because of the huge amounts of work from an enormous team of folks based in Massachusetts, around the United States, and globally focused on refugee and immigrant mental health. And then some of the particular work I'll be talking about today, which is called Trauma Systems Therapy for Refugees. So just a real honor to be a part of this team. And in addition to being on a team and just being one member of a huge group of folks, it's important to provide some framing for my own identities, my own positionality, and sort of how I come into this work. So that way you understand my own context. And so hopefully it's helpful to you. So some things I do know. So I know about some of the research and clinical recommendations in this area. So that's maybe defined as refugee and immigrant mental health or behavioral health more broadly. I know that our social and cultural identities and histories and social contexts deeply shape our lives. I know that we all have biases and prejudices and inequities built into our minds, and into our systems, our healthcare systems, our educational systems, even if we wish they weren't there. It's just part of the legacy of the human experience in the United States. And it's a painful legacy in many ways. And although I know some things, I actually don't know a lot more than that. So I don't know about all cultures. I don't know about your specific experiences with this work and how that shapes your current thinking and actions and the affect that you're bringing to this presentation, what motivates you to do this work, why you chose to attend this conference or participate in this session. There's a lot there. I don't have all the answers to how to best support and serve youth of diverse backgrounds. And even though I don't know a lot, I continue to keep trying and failing because those are sort of values that I hold. And taking it one step further, it's important to acknowledge the dialectic, meaning the sort of the multiple truths of my positionality in this moment. So I'm a white man, of a historically, colonizing background, in that my ancestors, came to the United States from other places. And so as a person with many privileged and observable dominant identities, I can try to use my relative power, unearned privileges, to influence what I'd call equity-oriented actions and equity-oriented systems change. So things that help foster the needs of the most amount of people and giving them what they need. And that involves at times stepping forward. So here my voice is centered in the context of this presentation. And then a lot of the times it's about trying to step back or understanding when to decenter my voice. And then potential cons of me, Jeff, in this moment talking about this work, is I perpetuate the role of white men in positions of authority, perpetuate something called the white savior industrial complex. Again, continue to perpetuate some of the colonization and marginalization of Black, Indigenous, and people of color and communities that have been historically marginalized. And so naming those processes is important, framing that. And I say this not merely as a statement, but as a commitment to action. I've dedicated my career to trying to engage in this work and self-interrogating my own identities and trying to do that in a way that helps kids and families who may benefit from it. So that's where I'm at, and I hope that's helpful. And thanks for listening. So we're talking about refugee and immigrant mental health. So it's important to define what that means. So this is the formal definition of refugee. It's an old definition. It's from 1951. It was evolved. It's sort of developed after World War II. And it's used by the United Nations. And so I'll just read it. So this is a person who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, has a well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country or to return there for fear of persecution. So there's a lot of information here. It's a really complicated definition. It's immigration and refugee health focused lawyers. A lot of their really challenging jobs is like, how do you support individuals or communities or families, and do they fit into this formal definition? And there are some folks that do fit into this formal definition, and then there's a lot of folks who actually don't fall into this formal definition, who you may think, if you're a epidemiologist or a child and mental health provider, a community worker, it's confusing why they don't fit there. And that's why it's important to acknowledge what sort of the lowercase r definition of refugee is. And this is actually the definition that our group at Boston Children's is more anchored around, which is someone who is forcibly displaced because of humanitarian crisis. And this could include folks in that first category, and it often includes a much larger category of folks. For example, many of the folks who have come up through the southern border of the United States from Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, a lot of those kids don't formally qualify for that capital R refugee status. However, they're certainly forcibly displaced because of humanitarian crisis, and many of the strategies and tools and frameworks that our group works on and the programs that we work with are trying to directly support those kids in those communities. So lowercase r refugee. because at the end of the day, these are kids and communities who are seeking a place safe from danger. That's what seeking refuge is. And, most folks who are humanitarianly displaced don't necessarily want to leave where they live. That's their home, that's their community. And they're seeking safety and seeking a place to build a life of meaning and purpose and dignity. And so if we as healthcare providers, folks who care about kids' health, or parents' health, that's really at the center of our work. If you can't provide safety, can't provide again meaning, purpose, dignity, then not really sure what we're trying to do. And these are big trends, big processes. So there's currently more than 80 million people worldwide who are forcibly displaced due to humanitarian crisis. And often these data here that I'm showing, they lag a little bit behind what's currently happening, just because it takes a lot of work to compile this data. The UNHCR has, in my perspective, really sort of often the most updated data if you're looking for this. This includes, of that 80 million, 26 sort of formal capital R refugees, and then approximately about 50% of those kids or folks are refugees are kids, pardon me. And then since about 1975, more than 3 million refugees have resettled in the US. Again, that's that first formal definition. The number is likely much higher if you think about forcibly displaced folks in general. And sometimes people ask me like, oh, refugee and immigrant mental health, that's really specific. It is, and about a fourth of all kids in the United States are from a refugee and immigrant background. Maybe they have a direct connection to a refugee and immigrant legacy. That's millions of kids. And designation as a refugee or immigrant is a socio-political phenomenon, and it's not a mental health or behavioral health diagnosis. And sometimes if you're on a behavioral health team, people can sometimes use these terms either as a pejorative or as a sort of marker for, oh, that means this or that about someone. And while it's important to potentially acknowledge this, it's important to acknowledge that it's a socio-political process. Also, in terms of documentation around that in your clinical notes, for example, it's important to be really thoughtful about how you're doing that, what you're including or what you're not including, depending on the population that you're working with. Refugee and immigrant youth and families are amazingly resilient. If you've had the great privilege or opportunity to work directly with a kid or family of a refugee or immigrant background who's been forcibly displaced, it's hard not to really be in awe of the resilience of these kids or families. And many of the folks, at least in our program that we're trying to support, understandably suffer the downstream effects of really systemic trauma, systemic oppression. When your body is overwhelmed by the worst processes of the human experience, it only makes sense that someone would have some amount of significant response and suffering. And the political is personal. So sometimes in healthcare and education, we want to remove political processes from the clinical encounter. Oh, I'm a doctor, this is a patient, the political is out there. Unfortunately, for kids and families of refugee and immigrant backgrounds, it's just not possible. It's not realistic. We're deluding ourselves if we do that. When there are immigration policies that are enacted, that directly impacts kids and families. When there are political processes that prevent folks from certain countries from moving to other countries, that directly impacts kids and families' ability to see people they love, to see their family, to be a part of the community that they were born into. Or if you're of a refugee or immigrant background, it just happens to be the lottery ticket that you received in life, where you happen to be born. I grew up in suburban East Coast United States. I was born in the 80s. If I was born in the late 30s, early 40s in certain parts of Europe, my dad's family is Ashkenazi Jewish, I would have had a pretty different experience in my life. And that's just where I happened to be born at the time when I grew up. And so in thinking about some of these processes, we really need to be attending to what's called the socio-ecological model. And folks who have an epidemiology background are much more expert on this than I am. And it's really the idea that we need to be attending to the diverse social ecologies that kids and families operate through. If you have children of your own, I have 2 little kids, we're often thinking about what are all the ecosystems that these kids move through. So their themselves, their own identity, their family, broader community, their peer group, the neighborhood and neighborhoods that they move through, city, town, state, country, culture. All of these are different communities that bidirectionally influence thoughts, feelings, behaviors, relationships, and identity. And we need to attend to these processes when we're thinking about how do we build behavioral health systems, programs to support kids and families. So if folks who are in this meeting are leading programs or providing direct services or analyzing data for mental health programs, trying to attend to those, socioecological processes. When we see how programs are doing, we're trying to look at service utilization, meaning how much of a program is actually being accessed. And the numbers are quite sobering in a lot of the refugee and immigrant mental health space, in child behavioral health in general and refugee and immigrant mental health in particular. So this is an old slide from a study from a number of years ago that my colleague Heidi Ellis ran, which is really that in a sample of 144 Somali youth living in New England, kids of a refugee background, of kids who met full criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a particular type of traumatic stress. So PTSD is actually, if you've worked in a clinical setting, can actually be somewhat hard to formally qualify for. There's lots of different criteria. So it's a particular type of traumatic stress diagnosis. Of kids who met this full criteria, which is harder, it's more significant to meet, only 8% of these kids received any services of any kind. And that can include a one-time meeting with a social worker. And so that's saying of kids, think about this, of kids who almost certainly could benefit from some kind of behavioral health, psychosocial support, they deserve that support. Why is this number so low? Why is it only 8%? And it's so low not because they don't have caregivers who deeply love and are intensely committed to them. It's because there are enormous barriers for engaging in behavioral health services. And when we can start to understand those barriers, it actually helps us build empathy and understanding for why those numbers are low and how we can try to build programs and systems that directly engage with the barriers that are built up because of the inequities in our system. And that's really our responsibility if we have the privilege of being in a provider or researcher role. So one way of trying to conceptualize those barriers is thinking about something called the Refugee and Immigrant Core Stressors, or Core Stressors and Strengths framework. And this is a tool that we use in our program. We actually have an online tool that I'll talk about later in the presentation where you can directly engage with these ideas. Really think about what are some of the common challenges and stressors that families of refugee and immigrant backgrounds are navigating. If you look in the sort of the bottom right, purple, call this resettlement stress, and I'll go through some slides that break these down more specifically in a little bit. So resettlement stress in the purple, acculturation stress in the green, isolation and discrimination stress in the red, and then traumatic stress in the yellow. And often for kids of refugee and immigrant background, families are contending with 1, 2, 3, often all 4 of these processes. And we need to be attending to them if we're going to be building mental health services, behavioral health services that are going to be sustainable and effective. And all of these processes have been enormously amplified in the context of the COVID-19 epidemic. Each of these phenomenon have a deep legacy of inequity, and the barriers that have unfolded and been revealed in COVID have made them, often in many contexts, that much more challenging. And part of the reason it's made it more challenging is because we have a pandemic that, like other pandemics, it follows the fault lines of society, exposing and magnifying the power inequities that were already there, that already shaped the population. So a huge majority of the economic workforce, the essential workforce in the United States, folks who, if they were not in those roles, the economy would not function, are of a refugee or immigrant background. And in those roles as essential workers, they are inherently more exposed to COVID process. They're physically doing that work that is essential for our economy to exist. And COVID-19 times the structural racism, bias, and inequity that exists in our systems lead to, and this is a term I learned from a psychologist at UConn named Dr. Wisdom Powell, a syndemic, which is really when conditions interact that engender greater morbidity and mortality among marginalized populations. So it's the interaction of COVID-19 and all of that with all of these other health inequities that previously existed, leading to enhanced disease transmission. And so this is a painful truth, and by revealing or at least acknowledging it, it helps us take committed action towards trying to be helpful. So let's talk a little bit about some of these stressors that I reference in the core stressor framework. Resettlement stressors, and if you think about your own community, your own city, you can think about either kids and families you're working with and how these map onto that, or your own personal experiences, either challenges that you've had with these processes or privileges that you've had, with these processes. So resettlement stressors, difficulties finding adequate housing, finding sustainable employment, sustainable employment that maps onto hours that work for your family. So common challenges, folks are engaged in labor or jobs that the hours are at night, and their kids are at school during the day, but then they're home at night. And so how do they navigate childcare if the job that they're attaining requires them to be up at night and away from their kids? Loss of community support and lack of access to healthcare. So for some folks, if you're formally resettled through a refugee mechanism, a legal mechanism, you can have access to healthcare. If kids or families are undocumented or underdocumented, you often do not have access to healthcare because you're not documented. So at least in Massachusetts, you can't even qualify for the government healthcare programs. So if you think about just how inequity stacks on top of it, even the things that are built to facilitate or reduce health inequity are not even available to some of the most vulnerable kids. The kids who need healthcare, more than anyone or as much as anyone. Acculturation stressors. Acculturation is really the normative process of moving from one culture to another, and that can be as big as moving from one country with one language and one majority religion to another country with a different majority language, a different majority religion, or it can be as small as transitioning schools or switching soccer teams or moving from one neighborhood in your town to another. That's adapting that acculturation process. For folks who are of a refugee and immigrant background, often it's many processes that are unfolding, learning the language, navigating cultural barriers and cultural differences. For example, if someone's coming from a more historically collectivistic culture and they're transitioning to a culture like the United States that is historically more individualistic, more linear, more top-down in some of the decision-making, what does that mean? Acculturation differences within families and communities. So a common process, something called the acculturation gap distress model, and sort of one version of that, there's lots, could be if, say I move to a new country with my daughters, and over time, they learn the language and the culture faster than I do. I'm used to being the dad, and I know how to order food and how to read a map and how to get to the doctor's office. Over time, they actually are the ones teaching me, and that can lead to a lot of pain on the parent side, a lot of additional burden on the kid side, and trying to navigate these power roles and how they've changed. So that can be a really major challenge for kids and families. And that goes hand in hand with difficulties understanding new systems. What do you mean I need to fill out this form in order for my kid to participate, or they have to go to the dentist every 2 times a year or 1 time a year? Like my kids, we only go to the dentist if they have pain in their tooth. Like the way that people think about healthcare and is very different in the United States than in a lot of other places. And then finally in this, for a lot of kids and families, they've had enormous educational disruption. For example, there may be kids who've been out of school for years, and then they're placed in a new context. Okay, now you're in 9th grade, so you're starting geometry. And not only is the kid learning the language and navigating the culture and navigating all the complexities, they also haven't been in school in 5 years. And so even just the mere process of being in a classroom and attending to work in that way is really new, can be quite disorienting. Again, kids are amazingly resilient and can do amazing and do very well. It's just really, really hard. Isolation stressors. COVID has enormously amplified these. I think most folks can relate to this. Feelings of loneliness and social isolation, lack of social support, both direct socialization and sort of more passive socialization, just being around other human beings. This can take the form of discrimination and bias, both overt processes and covert processes, anti-immigrant sentiment, direct experiences of racism, direct experiences of violence at the hands of community members or people in positions of power. Experiences not being trusted because of someone's observed identities, feelings of not fitting in, major losses of social status. So if someone has a particular, I'm a clinical psychologist, I have a PhD, I'm licensed in the United States to do my job. If I was to move to another country or forcibly displaced to another country, that PhD I have wouldn't really mean all that much because I'm licensed in the United States. And so all the years of time I spent working on that degree is, now what can I do? How can I try to participate? And that would be, for me, that would be very painful. And for a lot of folks, it's understandably very painful. And then changes to things like weather and transportation, where Massachusetts just snowed this morning for the first time this year. And when I woke up and noticed that, my mind went to folks who are now living in Massachusetts. There's a number of, for example, Afghan refugees who are now in Massachusetts. What is that like if they were living in a place, if they were living in a part of Afghanistan that didn't commonly have snow? How does that impact how they're trying to get to school or move through their day? And finally, traumatic stress. From a psychological perspective, trauma, and when we say trauma, what does that mean? Trauma occurs when a person experiences an intense event or situation that threatens or causes harm to their emotional and physical well-being and overwhelms their ability to cope. So, trauma is a subjective process. Two people can be in the same car accident, and one person has a real traumatic stress response, and one has a different, maybe not as severe response because of their the tools that they had on board to cope. It can also be related to witnessing or learning of an intense event that threatens or causes harm to someone else, hearing about a horrible thing that's happened to someone you care about. And for forcibly displaced youth and families, these traumatic stressors can occur during pre-migration, in their country or culture of origin, during the process of migration, and then in resettlement. And this is just sort of an example of some of the types of traumatic stress that can occur. I'm just clicking through them just to give you an example. In that study from my colleague Heidi Ellis, where there were, of the 144 Somali youth, where only 8% received mental health services, the average index trauma rating, meaning how many traumatic stress exposures kids have, was 7. 7 different events that alone would totally understandably lead someone to potentially pursuing some behavioral health supports. So to try to anchor some of this content, some of these frameworks, these ideas to some clinical processes, to clinical examples, and I'm going to link this back to some of the barriers we talked about earlier. This is a composite case example, so this is not, this is a fictional case, a combined of a couple of different cases that we've consulted on that I'll read through. And then we'll revisit this case later in the presentation. So this is Mustafa, so I'll read it. A 15-year-old Syrian boy, Mustafa, and his mother are in the waiting room at a hospital's psychiatric clinic. They're refugees who resettled in the United States a little over a year ago after fleeing war and conflict in Syria. An English-speaking clinician calls them into an office with a hospital interpreter and begins to explain the process of consent and confidentiality. Before the interpreter finishes the explanation, the mother hands a piece of paper to the interpreter and speaks at length in Arabic. The interpreter turns back to the clinician with a somewhat sheepish look on his face and says, she says her son isn't crazy, doesn't need to see you. She'd like you to sign this paper so that Mustafa can go back to school, and then the school actually is saying that he can't return to school until you do that. The paper in front of the clinician asks for formal verification that she, the clinician, has fully assessed Mustafa for mental health problems and that he's safe and ready to return to school. So there is a lot in this vignette. This is a very common experience. I've heard many providers talk about experiences like this. And it's important that we remember that this is not a vignette about a mom who doesn't love her son. It's actually the opposite of that. This is a story of a mom who deeply loves her son and is working very hard to keep her son safe. Because for some refugee and immigrant families, mental health services may be seen as useless at best and damaging and toxic to their family and community at worst. So again, important, let's take a step back on this one. So the degree that you have, that you spent years working towards to try to, contribute to society and help folks, is useless at best. And actually could be damaging and toxic. You could actually cause more harm. You would be helping more kids if you did not do your job. And this is, again, another painful truth that the more that we can acknowledge it, it actually gives us great power as providers. If you're interested in social justice focused mental health services, around how do I open the door for these services so that way I can actually help people in a way that's sustainable and helps people move forward, finding meaning and purpose. And in that vignette about Mustafa, you can see that there are a lot of barriers to mental health care. And on the left-hand side of the screen are 4 really common barriers to mental health care that are experienced by folks of refugee and immigrant backgrounds. These are distrust of authority and power. So if you grew up in a totalitarian context where people in positions of power have often tried to harm you or your family, it makes a lot of sense that when some random white doctor in a blazer is saying they want to help you, that you're pretty wary about that. And you're not immediately saying like, oh, great, I'm sure you're well-intentioned and really want to help my family. Linguistic and cultural barriers. So does the person speak the language or the dialect that I'm used to speaking to? Do they understand all of the complexities of cultural nuances of how human beings interact and how they view the world? Third, mental health and mental health services are enormously stigmatized around the world, and things have gotten better over time, have gotten better even in the course of my career. And often in many parts of the world and in parts of the United States, we really view mental health problems as a sort of categorical phenomenon. Either you're healthy or you're mad. That's a quote from a Somali colleague. And it's really trying to add complexity and acknowledge that mental health suffering, depression, anxiety, trauma are some of the most common health concerns globally around the world. And then primacy resettlement stressors, having a vague conversation, I'm a psychologist, I love thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Having a vague chat with the person you just met about the deep pains of your life in a way that feels sort of vague and like, what are we doing here? Is often very confusing for folks. And it's saying like, I don't have time to talk with you, Jeff. Like, I don't really know what this is about. I need to figure out how I get food, how I'm getting to work, and how I'm getting new jackets because it just snowed today. I need to figure that out. And so if we're trying to attend to these realities, we need to continue to think about how do we address these barriers. And I'm going to talk more about these. And so my hope that folks in this meeting, you can take some of these strategies and bring it to the programs that you're trying to build or that you already have built and trying to evolve so that way you can open the door for more kids and families. So thinking about community engagement, and I'm going to break down these slides in a minute, giving you more formal strategies. Thinking about community engagement through genuine partnership with providers and cultural experts, working with community agencies and cultural brokers, folks who are experts in the language and the culture. Embedding services in service systems, so really thinking about embeddedness. Oh, I'm going to build this great program that kids will come to after school. Okay, that's great. And often we're thinking about how do we embed programs in schools, in community agencies, in centers where kids and families already are going, as opposed to a big hospital clinic. And then integration of concrete services. How do we make this tangible and meaningful right now, or at least on the front end, so people see like, oh, wow, this actually can add value to my life for me and my family. And so the work that our group does at Boston Children's Hospital, a lot of it is focused on an intervention model that tries to do all these things, which is a big lift, it's a value. Those are our values. It's called trauma systems therapy for refugees, which is an behavioral health organizational model and a psychotherapy for folks who have plausible traumatic stress histories or traumatic stress symptoms. And so we're focused in TSTR, that's the acronym, on social environmental interventions. How do we do things in the social ecology? And then how do we, that's on the left side, on the right side, how do we build self-regulatory interventions, things that focus on, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, or action, awareness, and affect to help kids navigate the diverse ecosystems that they move through. And so the trauma system, this is a term used by my colleagues, Glenn Sachs, Heidi Ellis, and Adam Miller, is really thinking about both a traumatized child who experiences survival in the moment states, meaning that a traumatic stress response, a survival in the moment, is when we have a traumatic stress response, that's our body trying to not die right now. And it's very effective when we're in a situation where we need to not die right now. It's less effective when we are not in those situations. Human beings are unique in that we can have survival in the moment states compared to other mammals when we're not in a life-threatening situation. You can get a, hey, we need to talk, text, or email from your colleague, and it can activate a survival in the moment state. And in general, we think of that as not super effective, and that it leads to more suffering and pulls people away from their goals or values. And then that's one thing. And a lot of mental health interventions just focus on this left side, the pink side. We also really need to think about social environment and systems of care and their ability to help or not help the child regulate these survival in the moment states. So we need to attend to both the kid and the ecology because they're moving together. You can be an amazing behavioral health provider, and then when you send your kid out of your office or out of your virtual office, if the social environment, the school, the home, the community isn't able to continue to build on that, it's like moving chairs around on a sinking ship. It's like the ship is sinking. So what's TST? As I mentioned, it's this clinical model and an organizational model for thinking about traumatic stress in kids and families. And Glenn Sachs is a psychiatrist who developed the model with my colleague and the director of our center, Heidi Ellis. Glenn Sachs was originally at Boston. The program was built originally at Boston Medical Center, then it was at Boston Children's Hospital, and now he's at NYU in New York, and then our group is based at Boston Children's Hospital. And what we do in our program is we've taken TST, this sort of initial model, and built a number of pieces informed by public health and social justice strategies to really continue to open the door for the model for kids of refugee and immigrant backgrounds. And the original TST model, and you can buy it if you're interested, you can buy that book, Trauma Systems Therapy, is focused on school-based or outpatient level care, and then intensive home-based services. So sometimes we call that tier 3 and tier 4 in the purple. In our work, in the programs that we consult to throughout the United States and around the world, we're engaged in helping folks build out their TST style sort of outpatient home-based services. And we're also doing some other things. One is we're really focused on, going down the triangle, something called tier 2, which is more preventative interventions, really focused on skills-based groups. So group interventions in schools and community centers, focused on building skills, focused on navigating a culture of stress and social belongingness. And then at the bottom of that pyramid, the real base, the essential part of the programming, if you don't have it, the triangle, the pyramid falls down, is this is community outreach. And community outreach is one piece of community engagement, which is building genuine partnerships and relationships with folks in the communities that you're trying to serve. And then across all of this work, across every tier, every aspect of everything, we're engaged in deep cultural brokering, which means partnering dyadically with members of the community in actual service delivery. So in our psychotherapy service delivery model, almost all services, if they can be staffed effectively, involve dyadic service delivery. So if I'm a white man who's a monolingual, clinician, and I'm trying to provide services to say a Congolese youth, I need to work with a Congolese cultural broker who speaks the language of that community, of this child, understands the cultural nuance of that community, based potentially on their own lived experiences. And then together we work as a team in true genuine partnership to deliver the mental health services. And that's really what we do in our group at Boston Children's Hospital. And so I've put out this idea, and again, with TSDR, if you're in your program, you're thinking about, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's a big model. It takes often multiple years and external grant funding to put those pieces together. And if you're interested in that, then happy to talk further in a separate context. You can also pull out pieces, strategies for your own program that can be TSDR informed. And a lot of the things that we're doing are informed by these other public health models that far outdate the development of our work. So when I'm talking a lot about culture and the importance of attending to culture. And in my perspective, it's actually important that we really define what culture means. If you're saying, well, we need to think about culturally responsive interventions, what does that mean? So culture is a society's, these are 3 definitions. There's thousands of definitions of what is culture. Culture is a society's style, way of living and dying, attitudes towards women and children, old people, strangers, enemies and allies, eternity in the present, here and now and beyond. Woo. Okay, that's a humanities, that's from a poet. Hard to build a Likert scale, a 7-item scale around that. And that's a truth. Another definition, this is more from sociology, anthropology, the lived and inherited social and behavioral norms, beliefs, and customs of a group of people. And then the third is an organizational behavior model that's often used in workplaces. Values times behavior equals culture. What your principles are and what you do is your culture. And all 3 of these are correct. And there's many more that are correct. And what I would invite folks on this in this meeting to attend to is, how do you define culture? How do you define your own culture? And then how does that impact how you move through the world in your life, in your work, in your life at home, for the work that you're trying to do? And it's important that we acknowledge that, because sometimes people say, oh, well, culture is out there. I'm going to go, a personal pet peeve of mine is when people say, I'm going to go to a cultural event. Well, I'm not quite sure what that means, because every event is cultural. Do you mean a cultural event meaning an event that's of a different culture than your own? Right? It gets confusing. What does it even mean? So imagine, another way of thinking about it, imagine there are 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way who says, morning, how's the water? That fish swims by. The 2 young fish keep swimming on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks to the other and says, wait, what is water? This is water. Culture is water. It's the things all around us. I mean, another example is if someone says, like, oh, let's go out for ethnic food tonight, where there's a new refugee and immigrant community that's resettled here. Let's go out and have ethnic food. In that second one, what they're saying is, let's have a food of an ethnicity that is not my own, right? Because all food has an ethnocultural background. Pizza, hamburgers, steak and cheese, sort of majority culture foods in the United States, those have a cultural legacy. And so it's important when we think about that, what does that mean? What blindfolds am I moving through when I use these terms? And again, these are things we all have to, these are things that I didn't know and said and bumbled my way through. And then over time, as I've had the great gift of the opportunity to sort of reflect on these things. I hope folks have such a privilege as like reflecting on those processes, so that we can inform not just what you think, but how you actually act, and how that changes how you act to elevate the experience of both yourself and others. And in doing that, you're often attending to something called intersectionality, which is a term that's over 20 years old, developed by a civil rights lawyer named Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's been used in lots of different ways. Originally was used in a context for thinking about Black feminism. It's sometimes more broadly thought about now as sort of the interconnected nature of social and cultural identities. How our identities interact with one another within the context we find ourselves in, and then how power shapes and collides with us. So when I am in a majority white town in Massachusetts, how does that interact with my maleness, with my whiteness? When I'm in a context where I'm the only man in a room with all women of color, how does that impact my experience of maleness and whiteness? What do I do? What do I think? How do I feel? And in my perspective and in others' perspective, there's value in examining these individual parts of identities so that we can better understand how they all come together. So one analogy is, think about something like a chocolate chip cookie, again, something that has a interesting, complicated cultural background, invented in Massachusetts. Chocolate chip cookie also has a culture and also has an intersectionality in itself, so to speak, in that there's lots of ways of making a chocolate chip cookie. Even something as ubiquitous as a chocolate chip cookie, and based on the altitude and the number of eggs and the vanilla and the type of baking soda, the flavor and the texture and the taste can be very different. And that's all those pieces coming together to inform the uniqueness that is an individual entity. And so one tool that, if you're interested in continuing to do your own personal self-reflection, if you're working with teenagers directly in a school or in a therapy context, is a tool called the Addressing Framework, which was developed by my colleague Pam Hayes, who's a psychologist in Alaska. This is a framework for really thinking about individual pieces of identity in order to start putting those pieces together based on our own experiences. Pam Hayes and I and some other colleagues, a colleague named Siobhan Wardsley and I are working on building an online tool for using this Addressing Framework. So that's coming soon in the next couple of months. Right now, if you're interested in engaging this, we've made a couple of online tools, sort of worksheets. You can find them on a website called multiculturalpsychology.com. It's like a dinky website that I set up so folks can have free access to some of these tools. Free as in we have approvals from the various publishing bodies that have put those out there. That help folks engage with some of these tools, to do some self-reflection, to do some exercises related to this. And one of the things built into this, or another great book that Pam Hayes has written, which is called Connecting Across Cultures, the Helpers Toolkit, is thinking about bias and privilege. And I've alluded to a lot of these pieces already. We all have biases, and we're all biased. However, we don't all belong to dominant cultural groups. This bias is reinforced by social structures, and that lead to oppression and these both covert and overt factors. Non-privileged minority members are socialized to be aware of it, and then folks who are privileged in that identity may not. They're socialized to not think about it. They're socialized to not be aware of the indigenous legacy of the land that their house is on, that their hospital is on. Privileged members of these systems, again, can choose to ignore these lines, and then that privilege separates important information and opportunities. For example, working with a therapist if you've had a traumatic stress exposure. And so if you're thinking about, again, your own personal journey, your own program, two strategies that you can start to utilize. One's called cultural competency, one's called cultural humility. A lot of organizations prefer cultural competency because it's focused on gaining knowledge about the other cultures out there, ethnicities out there. What do I say? What do I do? How do I pass my online quiz so I can show that I'm culturally competent? And what I would say is that there is some amount of competency that's essential, a certain amount of what to say and what to do that you really need if you want to participate in your job and engage in equity. And in my perspective and many people's perspective, it's impossible to be fully competent in culture, other people's culture or your own culture. Like, how can you be fully competent? How many books? Is there a number of books that you can read? You can't. It's impossible. And sort of it's a fool's errand. And so a way to lean into that fool's errand and be more effective is a framework called cultural humility, which is really a response to the competency movement, which is really, how do we take a stance of curiosity and humility, self-evaluation and self-awareness, recognizing power imbalances, dismantling oppression, demanding institutional accountability. So it's competency is often learning about others. If you look at old multicultural psychology textbooks, that's really the focus. Some of that's important. If you're working with a community, if you're working with a Bhutanese refugee, understanding, what is the refugee forced displacement legacy of the country of Bhutan? What are the languages and religions of that community? What are some of the experiences that person may have had? That's more on the competency side. That's important. You can learn that on the internet. And that sets you up for a process of humility as you work with that individual, where you're looking at your own identities and you're trying to advocate for that person and continuing to find that line between openness and curiosity, while not sort of demanding a person to be the teacher to you. And this can also take the form in terms of thinking about how identity moves through the world. This is a framework from the psychologist Claude Steele. And some of this is popularized in a book called Whistling Vivaldi. It's basically the idea of threats on the ground or threats on the air in terms of identity contingent marginalization. That can, again, if you're working with a teenager of color, refugee, immigrant background, they have almost certainly experienced both of these types of processes. And they may not be fully aware of it, but over time as you work, you may notice it. Threats on the ground are directly observable processes that people may experience. Things that block their engagement with aspects of living based on their identities. Oh, because you're undocumented, you cannot have health insurance. You cannot attend this hospital. You cannot be on the soccer team because you don't have a social security number. Threats in the air are subtle, pervasive processes. Some folks use the term microaggression or microassault. One sort of more recent discourse around the idea around microaggressions is that there's nothing really micro about it. They're enormous. They just are harder to see and catch. And they're called threats in the air because they're actually harder to identify and interrupt. And they're things that what build up over the time that continue to perpetuate achievement differences and opportunity differences for refugee and immigrant communities. And that achievement gap is often the result of opportunity gaps. So they haven't had the opportunity to achieve in the way that they should be able to. Had they been given those opportunities, they would be thriving. And then one other piece, this comes a little bit more from Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility and a number of other books, is as you're taking this information, you're going back to your colleagues and thinking about how do you build equitable services, or how do we think about psychotherapy in this way, or healthcare? How do you have a conversation at the holiday dinner table around these ideas? We want to be thoughtful around flexing competency when we need more humility. Basically being mindful of our own identity credentialing when we use it as a tactic to remove ourselves from accountability. It doesn't mean that you can't acknowledge those experiences. It means that we can't use those experiences to remove us from accountability. So if I make a comment that implies some aspect of racism or homophobia or anti-immigrant sentiment, and say, oh no, I didn't mean that. Don't you understand? I do this job, have this relationship, know this person. That doesn't work. And actually often shows the lack of humility in that encounter. And if we can acknowledge that, gosh, even in spite of having these experiences, I still engage in this, it actually demonstrates how complicated these things are and how hard these things are and how much we need to, move in community together to try to navigate these ideas. So again, these are examples that I put there of possible things. Basically, these are my own identities around things that, in theory, that someone in my position could use as a way to remove themselves from accountability. And if I did those things, that would be examples of me engaging in racism or bias in a way that is problematic. And so if we continue to engage in these processes, continue to try to move in this way, what we're trying to do is facilitate something called culture responsive behavior and really a multicultural orientation towards the world. So given all these barriers, given all these complexities, how do we continue to facilitate connection and sustainable programs? So one I alluded to this is continuing to engage in processes that really focus and really center attending to community trust. How do we build trust from the community? And how do you as an organization, what do you do to engage? What can you do from your organization that shows that you will be there and that you will be consistent, that you will show up? And it's really a two-factor process in that there are things that you can do, and there are things that you can also do that help facilitate that from a community stance. Often people get stuck on this. If you look at the x-axis, the orange, they think engagement, which I thought this too, that engagement is the same as outreach. Outreach is like, oh, if we want to build more, we want to get more folks of this identity to our clinic, let's put up more flyers in the neighborhood where folks live. Okay, great. That's the absolute first thing that you maybe could possibly do. And there's so much more that needs to happen if you actually want to increase those numbers, you actually want to make an impact. And it's really hard. It takes a ton of work and it needs more funding behind it. And that's something, again, you can bring back to your communities, to your programs, to say, oh, wow, if we really want to do this, we need to do the deep work of community engagement as opposed to the initial work of community outreach. So I'll provide some more examples of these barriers and then strategies now that we've sort of had this tapestry of ideas that you can start to maybe lean on as you think about your own program and your own ecosystem. So integration of concrete services. So a common response, hey, we have this new program, we have this new exercise program, we have this new psychosocial support group, or this new soccer league, from a parent or a loving parent. We're too busy. I don't see the point of this. What can you do on your side? Focus on clarity, building the services within existing services and making it very clear where to go and what it is. Focusing on a team-based approach, working with bilingual, bicultural providers. So if you want to provide service to a community and you are not culturally super knowledgeable about that community, you need to partner with other people. So much about the vulnerability in our work at our group, we're at Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. These are programs and brands that have a lot of assumed expertise behind them. And while that's great in many ways, and that's a great privilege, if we go in and say, oh, well, we're from this program, I have this degree, and therefore X, Y, and Z, that's not effective, and we know it doesn't work, right? And so doing it not top down, but collaboratively and sort of more bottom up from the community, that's where programs are going to be more meaningful. You're anchoring around what do people actually want rather than what I think they need. What do people need? What do they need? As opposed to what I think they would like. And in doing this, providing warm handoffs, collaborative referrals, working together, again, in an integrated way, and then providing really effective framing about what services are and what they aren't, and how they align with folks' sources of pain, right? Framing is a huge piece of this work, right? If you frame a psychosocial intervention as a way towards school success, as opposed to, towards school success, as opposed to decreasing post-traumatic stress disorder, you can have the exact same intervention, and that 2 sentences on the front end can change how many people engage with that, how willing a parent is open to signing their kid up for that. Community engagement. I don't think they trust me. You're right. They probably don't, because you haven't earned that trust. Trust is really hard to gain and really easy to lose. You got to accept the slower pace. Trust takes time. It takes time to build trust from a community. You got to find clarity. You got to be clear about what people can do and what can't do. Often people, if they're new to systems and services, they may not know what providers can and can't do. Again, focusing on framing around a family's goals, beliefs, and values. Being mindful of your own integrity, right? There are hard issues. Mandated reporting, for example, for abuse and neglect. Those are real things that exist in healthcare. How do you attend to those in a way that's compassionate and thoughtful, and acknowledging, for example, if you're working with a parent of a teen who the parent is used to using more physical punishment interventions because those were the tools that they were aware of from their parent, and that's what they used in the refugee camp where they lived, because if they didn't do that, then their kid was unsafe. Now they're in a new context where those strategies are not allowed in the same way. So how do you name those processes and then help them move through that? And then showing up. There's a lot of, in refugee and immigrant mental health, or in some of this kind of work, people can say, oh, I want to do this help. I want to go in and do something and then leave. And that's okay. We just don't need a lot more of that. What we need is programs that are sustainable, that folks can show up and engage with it. And if you're going to build trust, it takes time. It's good to do a donation program where things were more transactional, or giving something if they build upon something that leads to a more meaningful legacy. Embedding services in service systems. So thinking about embeddedness. Again, if you run a group, a skills-based group, in the room next to the cafeteria where you have samosas and food of the ethnocultural group that you're trying to serve, and it's run by folks that they see in the school, as opposed to in a incredibly sterile, sort of scary, hospital clinic, it feels totally different. Focusing on asset-focused interventions, framing things in the positive, strengths-based intervention, as opposed to deficit-based framing. Oh, they can't do this, all these negative things. That's okay. It's just, again, not particularly helpful. There are likely lots of challenges, and how do we find the strengths? How do we leverage those strengths? And how do we continue to educate and engage wider audiences? When you're talking with colleagues or other community members, how do you provide education in a way that doesn't feel top down, that doesn't feel preachy, that doesn't feel, pushing people away, but invites people into the conversation, invites people into the opportunity to engage and participate, right? The last thing people need is, again, some white man coming in and telling people how they're supposed to think or feel. That's not the goal. If that's how you experience this presentation, I've totally failed. If you experience this, maybe like, oh, this is an opportunity to try to engage in these really hard topics and really hard ideas that we'll probably navigate our whole lives, then cool. That's more of what I think is realistic and effective. Partnership of providers and cultural experts. There's that fourth piece. Thinking about education and co-education, co-learning, not only psychoeducation. So psychoeducation is a term used in mental health, teaching about mental health processes. Often that can be sort of one directional. We want to think more co-learning, deep reflection, cultural humility, and then collaborative planning, really working together as a team. And then we're nearing the latter end of the slides here, and then we'll move to some discussion. I'm going to show this and a few other tangible tools that you can use. This is a framework that my colleague Heidi Ellis and my colleague Saida Abdi wrote a great article about, and it's been written in other places, thinking about community resilience, community programming, by thinking about bonding, bridging, and linking. And so really this is as simple as trying to think as, it's not simple to do this, but the framework I think is sort of elegant in its pithiness, is that how do we, if we're trying to build belongingness and connection, how do we think about strengthening sense of connection and pride within someone's community? And again, there are times where this is more effective or less effective. So there's lots of moderating factors about who and when and why. If you think about, okay, what are processes that can facilitate social bonding? What are processes that can help facilitate bridging across social and cultural groups? Often these are strategies that are happening in schools. And then social linking. How do we continue to build connections with relationships with people in positions of power? How do you foster ethnocultural pride in a way that's effective and equitable? How do you facilitate a multicultural orientation? And then how do you facilitate justice across levels of power? And so these are just, again, just want to provide some other examples of intervention strategies that we use. This is, again, another slide of that same pyramid from TSTR. I've said, this is a human service industry, and I'm thinking about the humans who do this service. So this is a team of Spanish-speaking providers that I've had the great privilege of working with over the past couple of years as we've tried to deliver some skills-based groups in some schools where there's a large Central American immigrant population, and how do we build those programs. And so just trying to show some tangible tools that do some of the things that we're talking about. So this is an intervention manual that we adapted, where we did engage in genuine partnership. So I was a psychologist leading this effort, and if you look at that manual developed by, all of those folks are of different social and cultural identities who have different lived experiences, and we're able to provide different cultural expertise and linguistic expertise on this intervention. And that we went into it piloting it, knowing that we were going to learn a lot. We did learn a lot. There were things that were effective and things that weren't, to try to help the kids. And we were really focused on trying to think about how do we take a strengths-based perspective on building belongingness, increasing resource mapping, increasing effectiveness, and how do we decrease things like a culture of stress and decrease stigma from behavioral health services. Now, this was an adaptation of, again, tier 2 skills-based groups that we've run in our program for more than 10 years. The Central American adaptation was new over the past couple of years. And so now if we have the privilege of engaging in these different ideas and maybe building new protocols or adapting new strategies, what could Mustafa's experience, if you remember Mustafa from earlier today, what could that experience be like? So the mother of 15-year-old Syrian boy Mustafa arrives at school to pick up her son, who had stayed after school to attend a skills group. As the group emerges from the meeting room, laughing and chatting, the Syrian woman who co-leads the group waves the mother over. They exchange a greeting and pleasantries, catching up briefly about their families and the community news. The group co-leader then asks the mother if she has a few minutes to chat privately. The group co-leader describes the boy's positive progress in the group and shares that he is continuing to have some trouble in the classroom and became upset earlier, knocking over some desks. The co-leader then shares that she's spoken with the teacher, who was worried, understandably, and wondered if they could meet together collaboratively with the mom and the group's co-leader, who's a counselor, a psychologist, to discuss how to help Mustafa succeed in the classroom. Again, strengths-based framing, collaborative. The co-leader added that she knew the mom was managing a lot at home, validating mom's experience, and could be a great opportunity to talk about how they could support those needs as well. Concrete. The mother nodded in agreement, and a meeting was set up for later in that week. Embeddedness. So within this vignette, we're pulling on a lot of different, again, this is a composite from real examples around how we build these pieces in so that way we can open the door for engagement in services. And in that first vignette, again, that was a context trying to provide psychosocial services to Mustafa. Same thing here. This example is much more likely to convert in that the family is more likely to engage and more likely to benefit from that information. So a few other tools before we close and move to some discussion, tools that you can start using in your group or your program right now. One is called the Refugee and Immigrant Core Stressors and Strengths Toolkit. This is an online tool from our program that sort of takes you through the 4 core stressors, provides some prompting questions for you to be thinking about either an individual kid or organizing service delivery. It's a tool that with somewhat limited marketing has been used on all continents in the world except Antarctica. So if you know any providers in Antarctica, feel free to email them. And if you use this link, and you'll have access to the PDF, or you can also Google our program, and there's a blue button above my head on our website you can click. And actually, it's exciting. One of our new grants provides some support for really updating this tool, and so it's a humble tool, and we're excited over the next year or two that it will sort of move into the next generation in terms of tech interface. Something else that might be helpful for folks who are doing assessment and programs, we contributed to recommendations around these comprehensive assessment batteries. In mental health, we use a lot of self-report measures or multi-informant parent or teacher report measures. This is on the NCTSN website around some possible measures that could be effective or appropriate for kids and families. And then the NCTSN website in general has tons of awesome resources if you're interested in traumatic stress and for kids and families. Here's another tool that we worked on in our program that I helped lead, which was a tool really around restructuring ineffective narratives that can come up in conversation, again, around the dinner table or in the boardroom or when planning services, for thinking about really bias towards refugee and immigrant communities, and then how to shape those narratives with the hope that it can lead to action. We did this in collaboration with colleagues from Boston Children's Hospital, from Teresa Betancourt's group, and then a number of colleagues who participate in these annual stakeholder meetings. And then this is just a really simple tool that a colleague and I worked on together during COVID, that for providers and for youth, around thinking about engaging in affective and cognitive skill building. We call this the BRAVE tool. I have a worksheet. If folks are interested, you can email me and I can send it to you. It's an unpublished worksheet. It's just a one-pager, really focused on thinking about how can you be brave during times of stress and adversity. Focusing on behaviors in your control, reminding yourself of thinking traps, what people sometimes call cognitive distortions, or really less helpful thinking. Acceptance of uncertainty, acknowledging there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, and the faster we accept that and acknowledge that, the more we can actually gain agency. Focusing on validating our emotions. So that's what I'm saying, acknowledging the pain and the guilt and the shame that may exist, so that way we can surface it and then do something about it. And then engaging in the present moment, finding ways to engage in value-based living, in the here, in the now. And these are tools that you can use for yourself, for your own family, use it in context for behavioral health service delivery. And then other additional resources. Here's a link of lots of different great programs that have wonderful resources. UNHCR, I mentioned earlier, for lots of tools, sort of at the big picture level. The US Department of Education has this really nice newcomer toolkit. The International Rescue Committee, as of this year, is in addition to our group, is another NCTSN Category 2, meaning treatment, development, and research program focused on refugee and immigrant mental health. Switchboard TA, which is the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, ORR's technical assistance website. They have a lot of wonderful resources. They have a lot of new great resources really focused on Afghan resettlement. If folks are interested in that, you can find there's a link right at the top of their page if you go there. National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which I mentioned, where we're a member in that group. And then again, the small website that I just set up to try to provide free resources for folks. And that's my email address below. If folks are interested in these ideas or want to talk further, feel free to email me. If you're interested in, how do you build some of this content or program, programming into your particular ecosystem, email me. I'm happy to try to be helpful. And thanks very much for your time and attention. And we can open it to questions.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Winter, for that great presentation. And so now we'll go into the Q&A portion of the session. We have about a little over 15 minutes. So please add your questions or thoughts to the chat. Also, we'll be sharing a link in the chat for a post survey where you can provide your feedback about this session. Okay. So again, if you have any questions for Dr. Winter, please add them to the chat. Any additional thoughts, comments, questions?
And I'm okay. I don't, if it's allowed, if folks want to unmute themselves or take a video off and just, ask directly, that's okay with me too.
Yeah, hello, this is Daniel calling from Madison, Wisconsin. You talked about cultural competence and cultural humility. I'm curious if you're familiar with the topic or the cultural safety and how that maybe compares with cultural humility.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, it's actually not my area of expertise. I've just been, one of my colleagues has been doing, I think, some of her doctoral nursing work in cultural safety, and so I'm just kind of here learning. And I know there's different terms, and I'm glad that you clarified kind of the difference between. I'm very, heard a lot about cultural competency, but I think, the context was in dealing with inequities in healthcare, and I'm not sure if it's more specific to medical care, but um, how we're supporting patients or individuals that were seen. I think it's more aligned with that concept that you were sharing with cultural humility, but I didn't know if you or anyone else on the call was familiar with that topic or that language, and how it compared similarly or different to the humility.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think if from my understanding of that, because I've heard both sort of cultural safety and a culture of safety, and I think they're probably two different things. I think one in the I referenced this framework called this idea called multicultural orientation. So again, all of these different terms, what do they mean? I think we're probably talking about pretty similar things. In this term, if people Google it or look up stuff, and there was a paper I referenced called multicultural orientation. Within a multicultural orientation, there are lots of different pieces. And so, for example, building safety or trust or connection or collaboration, really, that's at the center of a lot of these things. It can be if I'm understanding correctly, I think, things like, for example, facilitating safety and how do we do that? And that's one complexity of that in the cultural responsivity space is there's this idea, folks saying like, oh, let's create a safe space for talking about culture. And one of the challenges of that is, and I said that in running group therapy for years, like this is a safe space, or how do we create a safe space? Is I was given the feedback, not me personally, but a meeting I was at, it's actually impossible to create a safe space. This may be slightly different than the term you're using, Daniel. What we can do is actually try to invite people into a brave space, in that we feel brave to share. And right now in this meeting in the Zoom room, there's so much I don't know about all the folks and all the black screens with names on them about what people are bringing to this meeting and what's going on for them and what reactions people are having to my voice. And so as much as I can say, oh, I want to create a safe space, it's again, sort of a fool's errand. And so then how do we continue to try to open and foster bravery and openness, so that way we have this sort of ability to share and ask questions. So I appreciate the question.
Dr. Winter, there's another question in chat, but I wanted to first bring up for the survey. I know there's participants having some issues with accessing the survey. It's giving them the message of thank you for your interest, but you're not a participant for the survey. There's an error with the.
Yeah, so I'm just clicking the link that you put in the chat, and it's coming up on my end.
And I know I just checked it for me, but it wasn't working for me either.
Interesting. Yeah, so again, that's just a feedback survey for our group. It just helps me. So what I can do is we can check maybe after the meeting. It's working on my end. We've used that a bunch before, so I'm not quite sure what the issue is, but I can provide it to the conference organizers, and then if folks are able to, you can email it around to folks, or we can do a check on the back end. So sorry about that. If folks have feedback, again, feel free. You can just email. You can email me directly. Again, if you like stuff, great. If you want to give me constructive feedback, that's helpful too. So I see there's a question in the chat. What would you say the biggest barrier you see is in working with refugee populations, acculturation, accessing services, something else? Yeah, I think it's hard to say what's the biggest, because I think it's so context specific and different families have different needs. So in that online tool, the Core Stressor Toolkit, there's different, you can sort of rank based on severity, the different core stressors. And so again, I've worked with families directly or consulted on cases where, if you think about trauma, resettlement, acculturation, isolation, times where one of those is the biggest piece. So those are the four that I think are often the most important to attend to broadly. What I'd say is when folks are really more newly arriving to a country or a context, so if you think about, again, Afghan refugees, right now in the United States, the resettlement stressors are often the initial biggest challenge or barrier to navigate. And so that's often top of mind. So trying to attend to all of those concrete things. So if folks in your communities, if there are, and I mentioned the Afghan refugee resettlement because it's happened very quickly and very fast. There's a lot of complexity, and now there's 80,000 folks who are being resettled in the United States. It's a big number. And so folks are very quickly trying to navigate, where are folks, how are folks leaving military bases where a lot of folks were living? How do we set kids up for school, or how do we find interpreters? So that's often the front end. And then what can happen is over time, there's a lot of effort on the resettlement stressors. And then in the sort of second phase of resettlement, things like isolation trauma and a culture of stress become a bit more salient, and people have a little more bandwidth to engage with it because as the resettlement things get attended to. And often in programming, that's why our group is focused a lot on, in terms of our direct service interventions, more on acculturation, isolation, and trauma, because there's a lot of government programs, or there may be more psychosocial support services for resettlement stress, and then things fade away, and then we need to attend to those other things. So that's how I sort of think about that in terms of a progression of potential barriers. Oh, and just so if folks are seeing in the chat, it sounds like there was just some extra text at the end. So just clicking on that new link. Thanks, Emily, for your catch. So question in the chat, do you have recommendations for other clinicians, psychologists, mental health professionals working with refugees in other states? Can you say a little bit? Just would love to hear a little bit more about what you're thinking. Bernice, if you're able to take yourself off mute.
I'm Bernice, and I'm in Florida. We work with a group of refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of trouble trying to find mental health professionals that kind of understand the things that you've been talking about in terms of what their cultural background, how to work with them, keeping in mind the language barrier and all these other stresses that they are going through. So I was wondering if you have some recommendations, or some people that are trained as you. Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, thanks, Bernice. That's really helpful. So we have a couple of, so our group consults with a number of different programs in the United States and around the world delivering services. And we have a couple programs that we're working with right now where the primary population that they're serving are folks of a Congolese background. So I guess to get most pragmatic, Bernice, if you email me, I'm happy to try to connect you to one of those programs, which at the very least you can try to connect with a program that's trying to navigate that and may have, for example, hired cultural brokers who are of a Congolese background, or who are navigating some of those processes. Again, the challenges in certain communities, there may be, in your community, in your particular part of Florida, there may be, there may not be that many, I don't know the number of Congolese immigrants in that area, than the total number of folks who could fill a particular job or whatnot. So I'm happy, if you email me, I'm happy to try to connect you.
Okay, thank you.
So looking back to the chat from Sophia, do you see any limitations or problems with organizations? Oh, so this screen. Do you see any limitations or problems with organizations such as Peace Corps and the global aid work they do? How do you recommend going about discerning which organizations are actually making positive change? Yeah, really, really big, complicated question. Sophia, would you be willing to come off mic and say a little bit more? Okay, Sophia, if you're there, feel free to jump off mute and you can add some more context. I guess what I'll say is for any organization, I think really trying to understand what's the function of their work, who's funding their work. Oh, mic isn't working. Oh, shoot. Well, if it works, feel free to interrupt me. What's the function of the work? What's the funding of the work? Who is it serving? How are stakeholders engaged? What's the timing of the work? Again, one of these inherent other dialectics is around like, we need the work now, and things are trying to happen fast, particularly in like global aid contexts. Yet one of the other truths we're saying is, well, we need to accept a slower pace, and we need to take time to build relationships and sort of not be overly transactional, just because we just know that's not very effective and it can actually cause harm. And so really attending to those types of things. Again, so that way the work feels meaningful and sustainable and not just performative or, you know, kind of checking the box. And if you're thinking about, if it's something like, oh, I want to donate to an organization, where do I donate? Again, really trying to understand like, where does the money go? Like, what are people doing with that money? What programs is it funding? What services will unfold? And then how do we know if they're effective? You know, building some amount of research or evaluation around it so we can see if it helps. There's a lot of well-intentioned programs in the world, programs I've been involved with too, where it's like, it feels like it could be effective. And when we start to assess it a little bit more, and these things are hard to assess, the things that we thought were effective, you know, parts of it are and parts of it aren't, and we need to continue to adapt. For those types of assessments, again, trying to use mixed method strategies, so both qualitative and quantitative assessment strategies. Thanks for your question.
Okay, you have a couple minutes. Any last remaining questions or thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you again for your presentation. We hope everyone was able to gain some very valuable information from this session. Please feel free to navigate through the conference platform and add your thoughts and additional questions to the session, as well as learn more about previous and upcoming sessions for our conference. There's amazing content and information being shared throughout this week as we examine the roots and moving towards health and racial equity in maternal and child health. So we hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Again, be safe, and please remember to always try and take some time in self-care. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.